People of God, grace to you and peace. This is a reflection on John, the first chapter, starting at the first verse. It is the appointed lesson for the second Sunday of Christmas, which this year falls on January 3rd, 2021. We begin, as is our custom, with the lesson itself. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me.' From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." This is the gospel of our Lord. Thanks be to God. There are some things that are just so very hard to put into words. How can you possibly express the depth of love that you feel for your children? How could you ever adequately thank your parents for your life and for their care? How do you capture the grief and the embarrassment you feel for some tragic error in judgment, some profound moral lapse? How do you express the rage you feel against someone who hurt you or hurt someone that you love? How do you express the value of your sobriety or of your healing or of the forgiveness that you've received? Words fail us. They must fail us. And we sometimes resort to profanity or to volume or to some physical display to try to show the depth of our feelings, how much we care about this thing. But we're aware that these only sully what we're trying to express. And we long to say whatever it is clearly and memorably, decisively. Greeting cards and bumper stickers, they don't come close. And slogans are so trite and empty. Some of us look to poetry, and while this might get us closer, the words are always and forever someone else's words. The feelings, someone else's feelings. Some of us search for ever more extravagant and precise words. And while we may finally succeed in expressing what we wish to express, our new vocabulary either loses or alienates the people that we are trying to reach, the people that we hope finally hear. Most of us finally just try to live whatever it is we're trying to say, be it love or gratitude or forgiveness or peace. We hope that the witness of the years will finally give some utterance to what cannot be adequately said. And if our child were to truly doubt that we loved her, we could only point to the years of service, to the times we tried, and failed to capture the enormity of our love in words. And then we would weep. Some things are too big, too important, too grand, too everything to capture in words. Which brings us to our lesson today. How does one talk about Jesus? How do you start? What must be said? How do you capture and express who he is, what he has done, what he means to you, what he could mean for everyone else? How do you talk about the brokenness and the blindness of the world and of yourself? How do you talk about what you've received from Jesus' hands? How do you share the hope that is yours? Is it even possible? Would anyone understand? We talked a few weeks ago about how the other gospel writers began their testimonies. Let's review. Mark was the first gospel written. Maybe 25 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, certainly before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And Mark just jumps clean into the story. He ignores Jesus' birth and childhood. He starts with Jesus' baptism in the Jordan River. He is breathless. He's almost desperate to get all the pieces of the story down. It's almost as if he is still caught up in the whirlwind of Jesus' life and teaching. Everything seems very new, very fresh. Matthew and Luke come along about 15 years later. Jerusalem has been destroyed, and with it many of the old hopes and dreams and expectations. They've had 15 more years to think about how they will tell the story that's burning in their bones. They've had 15 years reading and thinking about Mark's gospel, and we know that both Matthew and Luke had and used Mark's gospel in the composition of their own gospels. Matthew gives us a profoundly Jewish Jesus, a Messiah who represents the fulfillment of Israel, someone who embodies all of God's promises and all the old prophecies. The temple may be gone, but everything that God intended lives forever in Jesus. Luke tells the story for a different audience, the non-Jewish world. Luke gives us the true king, the hope for all humanity. Luke wants us to see that Jesus really is what the Roman emperor and any other human authority can only pretend to be. Luke wants us to see that in Jesus, and only in Jesus, will the world find hope and justice and peace. And then 10 more years pass, and John, the disciple that Jesus loved, has become a very old man. He's had a lifetime to think about his friend and his master, a lifetime to think about what it means, a lifetime to think about how to tell the world what he knows, what he saw, what he heard. And after pondering and praying and learning and growing for something like 70 years, John tries to capture the majesty of Jesus. And to start his witness, he goes back to the very beginning words of the Bible, back to Genesis, in the beginning. It's almost as if he says, if I'm going to tell you about Jesus, you need to know from the very beginning that we're talking about God, about God's power, about God's will, about God's work, about God's designs. It almost explodes out of this old saint. It's a hymn, it's a poem, it's an opera, it's a monumental claim. It's an assertion almost beyond imagining. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Jesus was there before creation. He was with God. He was God. He was part of the creation of everything. Nothing was created apart from him. He is the source of life, and his life is the light of all people. And after all this time, and forever, his light still shines, and darkness has not, and will not, and cannot ever overcome his light. It's quite a start. And then you can feel John try to downshift. He tries to jump into the story as Mark had done about 35 years earlier. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came he came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. And then the majesty of Jesus strikes John again, and he's back into his hymn, his poem, his opera. Sometimes things are too big for us to tame as we would like. Sometimes wonder catches us up, and we get swept away. So it was, so it is with John. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become the children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. Don't you understand, John says? This was the true light of God, the master of creation. That one entered the world that he had made, and then an unbelievable, an unspeakable tragedy. The world he'd made didn't recognize him. The people that he'd called and prepared and led across the millennia didn't accept him. But he was undaunted. He continued his unique work, and his work was to make children of God out of people like us. Listen, John says, I will tell you a mystery. You may think you know what needs to be known. You may think you have a grasp on what matters, but prepare yourself for what could never be anticipated, for something that changes absolutely everything. God, the one true God, the master of the universe, the king of creation, the Lord of heaven and earth, took on a human body. He was born into this world as one of us. And his life here is a perfect witness of God's will, God's heart, God's love. If you want to see God, look at Jesus. No one else can show you God. No one else can teach you and lead you and rescue you and redeem you. No one else, only Jesus. Imagine with me John, the servant of God, the beloved disciple, an old man who has been thinking for decades about what must be said. Can you picture him rising out of his chair as he dictates and shares what must be known, what must be preserved, what must be expressed winsomely and powerfully and clearly? See with me a lifetime of reflection bursting out of him across time and space and culture to us, for us. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks ahead of me because he was before me.' From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." May we be given the grace to see Jesus as John saw him. to know him as John knew him. May we be given the grace to comprehend who it is who has come for us, who is calling our names, who would lead us home. Jesus, the Word eternal, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, God. Amen.